Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial. I know it's been a week and a half since I made one, but live with it. This is all you're gonna get. So today we're gonna be making this stabilized head effect. I don't know why. I just thought it would be a cool idea. I know it's been done in some music videos and some movies, but really I just took some footage of my head and we're gonna try to keep it still in terms of where it is, how it's rotating, and how close it is to the camera. So notice also in the beginning I get closer to the camera, which means that the whole frame has to shrink to compensate for it. And just to show you, this is what the original footage looked like. It's just me kind of like eyeing up the camera of my phone, tried to keep it as steady as possible, although it doesn't matter. You can have your head moving and the camera moving because we're just stabilizing it. It doesn't really matter. So, what am I even talking about? Let me show you how to do this. So open up Blender. I'm assuming you've recorded some footage of your head moving. If you don't want to record footage, you could donate to my Patreon, and I guess I'll make that available as a free file. It's free if you buy Patreon. But you can just record your face doing it, and this is a markerless method, but if you want, you can get some makeup from your girlfriend or your mom. Put a dot here, whatever. Okay, I feel like I'm all over the place. I haven't recorded a tutorial in so long that I don't even know what I'm saying anymore. So assuming that your Blender looks like mine does, meaning you haven't messed with the default scene, this is what you're going to get. We're using Blender 2.82, although the panels we're going to be using haven't been touched in a while, so you could use like 2.79 even. But once we open up Blender, I'm going to immediately hit Control N, and this is something I normally don't do. Hit Control N and then go to VFX, because pretty much the windows we need are faster to open this way. And also for the people who've seen me do tracking tutorials before, usually we record the video, so it's a movie clip. We turn it into an image sequence that's a bunch of images instead of a video so that it's frame rate independent. And then we do the thing and then render it back into a video. And while that's the better workflow, it's not what I'm doing today. Today we're just taking a video, turning it into another video. So once you have this panel open, we are going to first import in our footage. So again, we're going to be tracking. We need to track our head to stabilize it. So we need to know what the motion of the head is so that we can compensate by doing the reverse. So click open, navigate over to your footage. For me, that's going to be in the desktop. Luckily, there aren't too many options to choose from. Head source. And you can see if we play this now, we have the footage of me doing the thing. Some stuff to prepare is, you can see this purple bar over here. That's basically what's loaded into memory. So if we play this, hopefully it's gonna update. It doesn't seem to be updating very well. There we go. You see this purple bar is basically giving more of this footage into memory. We don't want to mess with that, so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna hit prefetch, and that's gonna make sure the whole thing's in memory. After a while, probably takes a second. And the next thing we need to do is hit set scene frames, because our project goes to 250 frames, whereas my video goes to 176, as you can see here. So hit set scene frames, and that's going to make sure everything is aligned. So now our project is the same length as our video, and the whole thing is loaded into memory. You can see this whole bar is purple. And I'm just going to go to the last frame because I knew something like this would happen. Last frame is empty, and that's why we usually do the image sequence thing, so we don't run into weird frame rate issues that cause the last frame to be empty. But if that's the case, I'm just going to shorten it to 175. No harm, no foul, we're fine. Only other thing we need to do before tracking is go to the render tab. Yeah, my skin doesn't look this white. There's an issue here. I tan, So what we need to do is go to the render tab, color management, change our view transform. That's how we are seeing color of, different things, including our footage. We need to go from filmic to standard. And you see immediately looks different. So filmic, I'm an alien, standard, now that's my normal skin tone. And now we are pretty much ready to go. So our footage is unaltered, we're fine with the frame rate and whatever. Even if this is 30 frames a second and we're using 24, we can correct that later. Or just do it now. Now we're going 30 frames per second. And now what we need to do is track our face, like I said, so that we can correct for it. And there's a lot of theory going on here. Really, this is a glorified tracking or stabilization tutorial with just a cool kind of head stabilization effect. But the theory here is we need to track, let's say, this dot right here, because we didn't add any markers. I just naturally have that like sunspot. We can track that, and then we have the location of that. We know where it's going. we can take that and do the opposite. If it's going up, we move the footage down, etc., and that will stabilize it. However, it doesn't solve for situations like my head rotating, because we only know the location of this point. So to stabilize for rotation of the head and scaling, like how close it is to the camera, we actually need to track 2 points so we can compare them to each other. So 1 point gives us location, 2 points, we can see if they're rotating relative to each other and if they're getting further and closer apart, which is scaling. So what I'm going to do is, again, here you can pick whatever you want. If you have acne, I know a lot of my viewers are like 13 years old, and Neutrogena tells you not to have acne. You want acne. It's going to help you do your tracking. So find a dot, find some acne, use some makeup. You can even use like the corner of the eye. Doesn't matter. Just find something that's, distinguishable. And once you found it, hold Control and click. So Control click adds our tracker. That's the shortcut. And we can also hit Alt S to have our search window. Hopefully you know a bit about tracking. I have a 4-hour series over on the CG Matter channel if you have no idea what I'm talking about, but hopefully I'll explain some of it. You can also use this to enable search and pattern. So once this is positioned, I'm not going to mess around with any of these settings because I don't want to. And then we are going to track forwards by either hitting Control T, or if you don't like hotkeys for some reason, you go to track and then you hit this button, which tells you to hit, or no, not this button. You hit, which one is it? This button? No, one of these, I think it's this one. Although that only goes 1 frame. Is it the one next to it? Yeah, it's the one next to it. So you can either track 1 frame forward or all the frames forward. So that's Control T or Control Alt T, but I'm just going to hit this button. And you can see we have our tracking data over here, our X and Y position, but on frame 86 it stopped tracking because I guess there was too much motion there or something. Actually, it looks like the frame is held. So what we need to do is manually correct this. So on frame 86, I'm just going to hit G to move this and then just kind of keep it in the same spot. And then we can keep tracking forwards. Hopefully it does pretty good. Made it to frame 87. Maybe we want to increase the search box, so our pattern that it's trying to follow. Again, it's only going to look for this inside the search box, so we want to make this big so that it's there on the next frame, but not too big so it takes forever to calculate. Does that help? Yep, that made it to frame 117, and generally you're not going to be able to track everything in one click. Sometimes you have to do some manual correction, so just, do anything to it, and that's going to add a keyframe, which means now this is what it's going to reference as it keeps tracking forward. So Alt right arrow, and you can see here it makes sense that it stopped tracking because there was a big jump. So we can make that a lot bigger. Hopefully that helps. And I guess this is because my phone has like weird frame rates and stuff. It doesn't record normally. That's why there's some like duplicate frames and stuff like that. But hopefully we can make it to the end of this. Okay. And again, I hit Control T to not go frame by frame. So we now have our tracker information locked in, and we can just play that. Looks pretty good. If we want to see what it really looks like, hit L to lock it to the center. And now you can see that's this is kind of like the stabilization almost. You can see this tracker, if I keep my mouse over it, it's not going to move. So it's actually moving the footage to make that work. But if I exit locked view so that it's just playing normally, you can see we just have a tracker. Once we're happy with it, you can lock it by either going to track and clicking this lock button or hit Control L. Boom. I feel like this is a refresher on tracking in every way. Okay, so we could stabilize this now, again, only in terms of location. Like I showed you here, this only stabilizes the location of this spot on my head, but notice that it's still rotating. And the getting closer and stuff isn't, we haven't corrected for this either. So what we have to do is, again, compare this point to another or a couple others to stabilize the rotation and scale. So I think this is probably a good candidate. Maybe you have facial hair. You can even do your nostril, the corner of your mouth. It doesn't matter. So just to show, I could have picked the corner of my mouth. So maybe some of you don't have acne or sunspots, but most of us have mouths. So if you pick the corner of your mouth, you can see this is tracking, right? There's no excuse. I mean it's going to drift a bit because it's not a perfect tracker, but nobody has an excuse. So I'm just going to pick this because it's very distinguishable. And hit Control T, see how far it makes it. And the reason I'm not cutting this like correction process, I'm not editing the tutorials because I'm lazy, but also I feel like it's valuable. So here you can see it's drifted off a bit, and we can keep it that way and have our stabilization suffer a bit. That's what's going to happen. So bad tracking means bad stabilization, or I'm just going to go back and find the last frame where this was correct. So it seems like here it was fine, but then it kind of went off track, and then I'm just going to correct it and then keep tracking for it. So like I said, I'm lazy. I'm not going to edit this tutorial, but also I feel like this is the useful part of the tutorial because this is what you're going to struggle with. You're going to be like, oh, there's motion blur. It's not tracking anymore. So in this case, you could either add a keyframe or make your search window a bit bigger, which is also adds a keyframe, I believe. And while tracking, it's a good tip to hit L to do that locking thing, just so you can see where you are. We kind of went a bit off there, but that's fine. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. If there's only a slight deviation in your tracking, there will only be a slight deviation in your stabilization. Okay, we made it to frame 175, Control L to lock. So what do we have? We have two trackers. We can either lock according to this tracker by hitting L. Actually, we already were locked, so now we're locking onto this. Or we can lock on to this one. I keep hitting L too many times. So either of these can be used to stabilize a location. Like we talked about, you only need one tracker for a location, but these in tandem combined as twins hold the information for rotation and scale. Notice that imagine there's a line between these. Notice how that line is very skewed here, meaning that my head rotated, and then the distance between them goes up if I get close to the camera. Okay, cool. So how do we actually stabilize this in terms of everything like we've been talking about? First, let's save our project. I'm going to call this stable CG. It's just what I'm calling it. To do this, what we need to do is we go to the stabilization panel. You might have been eyeing it up and been like, it's probably what we want to do, and it is. Go to stabilization. Enable 2D stabilization, meaning that we can now stabilize. And notice that here we have a window for tracks for location. And this is saying which of these trackers, so here's a tracker, they have different names. This is probably tracker 1. We can find the name here, track 0.001. Which of these are going to be used for location? If we just select this one and click add, now this is going to be used for stabilization. Let me disable this. You're going to notice that nothing's actually happening, but we need to actually view our stabilization. So go here, clip display, enable show stable. And now you can really see, now it's kind of really obvious what's going on. Alternatively, we can not use this. We can use this one. And now it's going to stabilize there. But notice that here, everything is kind of like in frame. There's nothing that's off frame, but then stuff goes off frame. But there's no reason that we can't have this frame right here be our like reference, our anchor frame, in other words. So this is frame 36. So if we change this now, frame 36 is where everything's filled in, and then if we go backwards, it's going to kind of deviate off. So you can choose what you want that to be. I'm going to pick one, and yes, I think you can pick multiple trackers for a location, and this is going to kind of average them out. So it's not possible for both of them to be stabilized in terms of location, mostly because they're rotating kind of like relative to each other, so it's not possible, but it's going to do its best to stabilize both of them as much as possible. So what I like to do is only use one for location, but you could use both. It just depends what you want. One gives you a very locked on feel, another just gives you a vaguely centered kind of feel. Okay, cool. As for rotation and scale, you enable rotation, you enable scale, and now you have this window, and as you expect, we're going to put two of them. So adding only one doesn't really matter. You need both. So we're going to select both trackers, click add. And now, again, this is our anchor frame for both location, rotation, and scale, so everything's going to be nice and in here. But then as we play, you see our frame is not only moving, but also rotating. So here it's tilting. There's a bit of glitchiness going on, which means the tracking wasn't the best. But notice there's also scaling here. It's getting smaller. And if you notice some glitchiness, so let's try to find a glitchy frame maybe. Right there was a glitchy frame. Where was it? It's kind of hard to tell. Basically, if you have a glitchy frame, what you can do, oh, there it is. You can see in this tracker, this is what we're trying to track, but then here we deviate, and then I guess we keep deviating. So what we'd have to do to fix this if we wanted to is unlock the tracker and then track. Is it forwards or backwards? It's one of the two for sure. But you can basically correct this, so make sure, for me, I think it's backwards in this case, so you can just track backwards. And if it's not cooperating, you can always do this manually. But once we do our correction, you're going to notice that what's going to happen is that our stabilization is no longer going to do that weird thing. Okay, so we only have to correct 2 more frames. I'm going to do it manually, even though tracking might be faster. Okay, so now we have a nice smoothed out path. You can see even the spline looks nicer. So now lock this back in and notice that even though we messed with our tracker, it's still in these 2 categories, so it's automatically going to fix. So our glitchiness was around frame 90-ish, so now if we play this, we're about to get to 90, and we passed it, there wasn't as much glitchiness. So that's how you fix it. Now again, not the perfect result, but now you know how to fix it. And before we actually, I show you how to render this out with compositing, I just love the way this looks, by the way. Just such a cool effect. We actually have some creative control over this. The same way that I said we can add 2 location trackers, we can do a bunch of other stuff that's actually more powerful. So if you scroll down, you see auto scale. You can enable this. This is what's going to make sure that everything's in frame all the time, that you never have anything in the border. Let me just undo that. Never have anything in the border, although as you saw, auto scale has to zoom in pretty far if you're deviating a lot. So that's why I like to keep it off. What else? These 3 are the main sliders you're playing with. So again, we're stabilizing for location, rotation, and scale. But if we take our location influence and turn it to 0, now we're only going to be stabilizing for rotation and scale. And you can see that because this thing, while it's rotating and scaling, you can still see my head moving, right? We haven't centered it. If we have, let's say we have no rotation, you're going to notice that my head is centered, but once it starts tilting, it actually does tilt. Whereas if we increase the influence, it corrects for that. For scaling, as you might expect, so here I'm getting close to the camera. If this has no influence, then it doesn't matter. But if it does have influence, if I get close, it's gonna scale down. And you can pick values between 0 and 1 for each of these. There's some other settings. Forget about it. That's the main stuff. Okay, cool. And again, you can always use makeup. I don't know where it went, but whatever. So now you want to render this. So I'm going to save, and you're like, okay, I want to render. F12 render. You see this, it's a gray rectangle. It's not what you want. So what do? We go to the compositing workspace. This is where it's going to show what's being rendered. And right now it's showing nothing, so enable use nodes. And you can see what's happening here is we have our render layers node, and that is what's going to the composite. In other words, this is what is being rendered. Well, the render layers node is just what's in our 3D viewport, right? So if we go to our 3D viewport and then go to camera, you see it's showing nothing, right? So if we add a cube and then hit F12, now it's rendering a cube. It's kind of gray, but you can see it. So we don't want the 3D viewport. We just want what we did over in the movie clip editor. That's what it's called. This thing. We did our stabilization in here. We even, enabled show stable and all this. But this is just viewport stuff. It doesn't matter. So what we need to do is send all this information over to the compositor. So in compositing, which I need to make the compositor again, we don't want render layers. No. We don't want it. What we want instead is I'm going to add, by the way, that's Shift A to add a movie clip node. So this is where you import in movie clips. That's right. And for our movie clip, we are going to choose our same video. It's going to be here because we imported it in another part of Blender, and it's convenient like that. And while this is working, we're not going to see anything. Like if we hit render, it's going to show, but it's not going to show in our viewport type area. So what we want to do is add a viewer, and you can either do that by Shift A viewer and add a viewer, or what I like to do is have Node Wrangler enabled. It's an add-on. You type in Node Wrangler. If you don't have it, you enable it. That's it. And then you hit Control-Shift-Click, and that's going to add a viewer that's already connected. So you can see now we see it in here. We go to different frames, and it takes a bit, but it does update. And this is probably the worst part about Blender. Its compositing is garbage. It just takes forever. But you can see it does work. So what we want to do now is we have our movie clip being rendered and also being viewed. This is what we're seeing, but no stabilization's happening here. My head's still moving, rotating, etc. And that's because we're just pumping the video clip into what we're seeing in rendering. So what we need is a stabilized, so Shift A to add a stabilized 2D node. Okay? So we're going to put this here, and also we want this to be what is rendered. But it doesn't know, again, we want to stabilize this, but what stabilization should it use? It can stabilize it however. Does it want it to turn upside down and move to the left? I don't know. So what we're going to do is we are going to load in our video. So same video that we have here, load it in. And because this is what was in the movie clip node, this is corresponding to the stabilization that we did over here, right? So if we added another, like a head source 001, and we had a different stabilization here, we don't, but let's say we did. In the compositing, we can then choose. We can choose, but I'm just going to choose this one. So notice that frame 1, everything's positioned because it's our anchor frame. Go to a different frame, and you see the whole frame is tilted and scaled and moved, which means it's working. So let me go to another frame, and you can see everything is going. It's like butter. It's working. So if we now go to like frame 147, which, I'm doing something. If we hit render F12, it's going to take a bit longer, but you see everything is working the way that it should. One more thing I want to talk about before we render is that this stabilized 2D node has a very, very useful feature. Inversion. You're thinking, why would I want to invert? I want to stabilize. Huh? There's a very, very, very useful purpose for this. This is actually the feature that I think nobody knows about, but is super cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add stabilized 2D. I'm going to add another. Notice that this is using the same movie clip. So it's applying our stabilization twice. Doesn't really make sense, but I'm going to apply it, and then I'm going to apply it again, but inverted. So in some sense, they cancel each other out. So one will like nudge something up to the top right, and then I inverted it, brought it back down. So effectively, just plugging this into the viewer is the same thing almost as plugging this into the viewer. You're going to notice that there's a bit of a difference, and that, I think, is part of the image sequence movie clip issue. Might be another reason, but this is why I always use image sequences, so we don't get weirdness like this. So, but it's about going to keep everything centered, minus some technical issues. But what that means is if we put something in between, it's going to be on top of our stabilized footage and then invert stabilization, which means it's going to move with our head. You have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add, something random. I'm going to add a bokeh image, that like a pentagon. So I'm just going to composite these together. Don't worry about what I'm doing. This is just like a example. You could do a image, you could do whatever. Not a translate, we want a transform. So I'm just going to like put this little thing on my forehead. So I need to make it a bit smaller. And then also relocate it. I'm not going to do this super precisely. Okay, whatever. It's on my nose. Okay, so imagine we have this thing on my nose. And again, what's happening here is we have our video. That's stabilized. I'm then overlaying our pentagon on top of it. And right now, since that's what we're viewing, it's just going to be stabilized. So it's going to be in about the same position. Again, not perfect, but it's pretty good. Okay, but then we take this and we do the stabilization, but backwards. So now if we view this, now it's going to be pretty much our original footage, so it's stabilized and then not stabilized, but the same thing also applies to our pentagon, which means if we go to our first frame, it's going to be here. And then as we go through the footage, and I'm like tilting my head and stuff, I'm trying to find a good frame where I do that. Yeah, here, you see it's moving with it. And try to wrap your head around why that works. Again, it's not perfect, mostly because this is a three-dimensional surface, but whatever. But just wrap your head around why this works, and think about why this is a super useful thing. This is how you attach objects to other objects. You stabilize them first so they're not moving, then you overlay them, and then you have them move again together by inverting the stabilization. Okay, whatever. That's just a small tip. So here's our basic node setup. Footage, stabilized, viewed, and rendered. I'm going to be using Eevee. Doesn't really matter. Lowest samples, it's just pumping video into this and moving it around. And then for the output, which is what we're going to render, I'm going to pick FFmpeg, which is how you render video. Unless you want to do AVI, I'm just choosing MP4. These are just settings. I'm just rendering a video. Doesn't matter. I feel like my voice has gone deeper as we're going to call this voice getting deeper. and we can hit render, Control F12 in this case, and it's going to go frame by frame. And notice it's going to be kind of flashing because, that's how it looks. But you can see, I was pointing to my screen as if you can see that we have some gaps over here, meaning that the stabilization is actually happening. So I'm going to render like maybe to frame 60 so that we can see a small snippet of the video and show you that it works. But again, we could play around with the expected location, rotation, and scale like I showed you to get different kinds of stabilization effects. So, okay, we went to frame 80, and now let's see. Hopefully I did that on the desktop. Oh, here it is. So let's see it. There you go. You can see it's stabilized. And again, the quality of the stabilization pretty much is the quality of your tracking. There are some caveats about like 3D perspective shift and all this. Forget it, okay? It doesn't matter in this case. But yeah, that's the effect. Here's what it looks like in full. And again, this is just the super locked on. I had all the values set to 1. We could have different kinds of stabilization effects. Again, like we said, here it's cool that we can see it in the viewport so quickly, but then it takes forever to render. But yeah, we could have an effect like this, or we could have both, or we can have all of them at 50%, 60-ish% influence so that they're pretty stable, but there's a bit of leeway for like rotation. So it's moving a bit, just not as much. But yeah, there you go. You now know more than you probably ever did about stabilization. So if you want to help support these tutorials for today and for the future, the best way to do that is not liking, it's not subscribing, it is donating to the Patreon. I call it a donation because it's just a generous act, but it's also a bit of a purchase because you get some exclusive tutorials, you get some behind the scenes stuff mostly for CG Matter, you got scripts and early access and all this. So if that's something you're interested in, or you just like these tutorials and want to fund them for the future, because this is my job, that is the best way to do that. But anyways, thank you for watching this free tutorial. I've been CG Matter Default Cube. You've been you. You know the rest.